Now, as eyes turn to the union buildings for that much anticipated address by the president, the subject of corruption, fraud and accountability is top of mind. Don't be fooled into thinking that private sector corruption had its genesis during the Zuma years. It had mastered the art of corruption long before. Well, that's not my view. That's the view of academic and activist Khaya Sithole, who joins me now. Good evening, Khaya. It's lovely to have you. Thank you very much for your time. Let's take that ignominious walk, shall we, down history lane and who perfected this corruption model in terms of the way you're thinking.
Good evening, and good evening to the viewers. So I think what has become really the endemic disease in South Africa, the corruption disease, is something that obviously requires to be fixed. It's something that we need to keep interrogating. What is also quite important is for us to be very honest about what exactly it is that we're trying to deal with. And of course, given the scale of the corruption we've seen in the public sector over the past 10 to 15 years in particular, there's a tendency to then believe that we're dealing with a public sector problem. However, what we now know is that essentially even those public sector actors who mastered it did so with the assistance and the complicity of some very significant private sector players, which is why the issue has become so entrenched into, the social fabric of where we are. And if we're going to deal with it decisively, we cannot afford to leave any stone unturned. So we need to be able to deal with all aspects and all manifestations of corruption as we know it.
All right, let's go with your characterization as state capture being this twinned enabling complex between the public and the private sector. Talk to us about the private sector taking the lead, kind of creating the model and then also exploiting open opportunities in the public sector where they found them.
One of the most important observations that we've seen is that obviously the big issues that we're dealing with now, whether you saw them at the Zondo Commission and other manifestations, were issues that related to, that had an element of sophistication, if you can put it like that. And what that element of sophistication enabled those individuals to do was to be able to get together and put together some very, very complicated deals that then gave them the ability to essentially redirect public funds. And when you then look at the type of sophistication that we're dealing with here, a lot of those practices were practices that we would see being replicated in the private sector in multiple manifestations. So if you look at, for example, at how McKinsey's involvement and how Bain's involvement in state capture, for example, tended to be, those people simply leverage what were pre-existing business models around how you get into a consulting relationship, how you are able to essentially get particular organizations to really depend on you for particular services to be delivered. And once that sense of dependency has been created, then it doesn't matter how much you bill or how much you charge because they have to pay it. So you saw institutions like the South African Social Security Agency, for example, not being in a position to essentially run the social grant system on its own, which meant that it became so highly dependent on an organization like CPS. It then meant whatever CPS wanted to do, SASSA had to proceed with it because they didn't have any alternatives. So it was really that intersection between the private sector models that we've seen and the private sector weaknesses that are being exploited that enabled many more of these deals to go through the process and quite simply become entrenched and become the hotbed for the corruption that we're now trying to unpack.
Which dovetails quite elegantly into the role of auditing companies like Bain and Company and others. Tell us more about how they've played their hand.
So, of course, consulting companies and auditing companies in particular do enjoy a very unique social license. When you look at auditing companies in particular, it is impossible for anyone to sort of run a business without having some reliance on the auditing industry because it validates whatever you claim to have in relation to how your business is being run. So because they've got that permanent social license, everyone has to work with them. Now, of course, what comes with that social license is a sense of expectation that, look, once that big four auditing firm has signed this off, then we probably are a much better place in relying on it. And what that simply means is that very few people would ever question the conduct of a company like Steinhoff, for example, if it says that our financial statements have been audited by Deloitte, for example. So what that does is that it simply then creates this ecosystem where all you need is to sign up one of these blue chip multinational auditing and consulting companies, and as soon as they put a stamp of approval on your books, and as soon as they put a stamp of approval on whatever it is that you've done, very little can be done by outsiders to start questioning the merits or even, the integrity of the information that is being communicated. So once that starts happening, it simply means that people are able to get away with some of these issues for a bit longer, are underpinned by the sense of the prestige associated with the fact that, well, we've used an international consulting firm, so how can we possibly be wrong about what we're saying?
And as you say, that prestige, a Trojan horse for malfeasance. Well, Bain is banned from tendering for public sector contracts for 10 years. McKinsey's indicted for corruption, fraud and theft related to state capture at Transnet. How much further should law enforcement go towards getting accountability and restitution? And of course, one of the other reasons we're looking at the union buildings tonight is to see what the president will say on beefing up institutions to ensure that exactly what you're talking about can never happen again.
Yeah, so we had this unfortunate turn of events in particular where Chief Justice Raymond Zondo seems to have taken the morally untenable position that once an organization like McKinsey has paid back what it is that we found out they took, incorrectly from a company like Transnet, for example, his view seemed to have been that that's good enough. That's a form of repentance that is necessary. I do not share that view. So even though Transnet was able to get back some of the money that McKinsey had stolen from them, the key question is that an organization that has conducted itself in that manner should indeed lose the social license to operate in this country. So the distinction here that has to be made is the one between a social license and a commercial license. So when I say that these businesses ought to lose their social license, it simply means that we, as taxpayers who fund all the state-owned enterprises, should be able to say that we do not want any of our resources to support a company that has previously conducted itself in that manner, regardless of whether they paid the money back or not. So what has happened with Bain in particular is that social license that they lost when many people said no company should be doing business with them, it has now been converted into essentially a loss of a commercial license, where National Treasury says that you cannot bid for public sector contracts because suddenly it's no longer a matter of the fact that people do not like you. It's now a matter of we are going to prevent you from benefiting from a state that you tried to destroy in the conduct that you undertook at SARS, for example.
Almost out of time, but want to squeeze this in. There's a post-apartheid lesson here that you say needs to be learned about private capital and the way it thinks. Would you share that with us?
So what we do know, unfortunately, is that the way capitalism works is that it's a matter of you need to outscore and you need to out-earn your next competitor. So greed is actually the driving force underpinning capitalism. And of course, if that is going to become the way things are, we should expect that when we hear about matters of corruption being unveiled, it is not a matter of the industry at large and saying, dear God, this will never happen again. All it does is that it enables your competitors to know what not to do in order to avoid getting caught. Yeah. That is the problem that we have here. In that nobody in the consulting industry is looking at McKinsey or Bain and then saying, dear God, these are the things that should never, ever be done. The lesson that seems to emerge is these are the things that you need to avoid doing in order to make sure that you do not get caught. Because for as long as somebody believes that the only way to get business is to be able to break the rules and simply push the envelope as far as you can, they're all going to do it in one form or another. So The lesson is not what these people are going to stop doing. It's simply how they're going to avoid being detected.
Academic and activist Khaya Sithole, always appreciate your views. Thank you so much.